morning. I'm over here. Uh, so your answer to Senator Gomes and others makes me just want to get clarity because I was driving up here listening, and so you went in and out sometimes. And I thought, at least initially, before your interaction with Representative Tong, that you had mentioned gateway drugs. Was that true?
Sorry, say that again.
That you had talked about gateway drugs in your testimony?
That was his question.
But you hadn't mentioned it before that?
No.
Okay. So I guess I have a question about the study that was discussed earlier about what has happened in Colorado. It was the Rocky Mountain, that one. So in that study, the increase in driving under the influence and the accidents that happened concomitant with that, that 48% that we talk about, I recognize that there's that increase in the study, but they only looked at two different sets of time periods that were 2 years apiece. As an expert in these types of things, that doesn't. I'm asking you this question. That doesn't seem to me to be the most valuable data. I think you would need data that examine time periods longer than that. Would you disagree with that?
In order to be able to make the relationship between legalization and motor vehicle accidents is
right.
I'm sorry.
So, Doug, can you move a little so we can see each other? So, because we're both doing this. So, I'm sorry. So, I'm just trying to make sure that we think that the data set is actually useful. Given the way that the data set in that study, I went and read the study. Given the way that the data set works in that study, I'm not sure that it's useful because I've read studies in preparation for this hearing. I've read studies where it was suggested within the study that the people writing the study believe certain things, but because they didn't have enough data, they wouldn't come to a conclusion. Looking at the study that has been referenced, I don't see there as anything more than the set of this 2 years to another 2 years. And it seems to me not to be enough to draw a conclusion. And I'm asking you as an expert who deals in these things, whether or not you believe that or
not. So absolutely having more data is always good. There's no question about that. The data I've looked at in this report and the report from the state of Washington looked at time periods before legalization and after.
Right.
And those were relatively short time periods, and I think both of those reports have shown that there's been an increase.
Right, but you could have an increase, and the increase could not be due to the fact that you had legalization, which is why it's particularly important in most studies to have a larger data set.
Yeah. So having a large data set, yes. So I guess one of the ways of responding to that is we are never going to have perfect evidence. And the best evidence that we could have about driving and marijuana or driving and alcohol would be the following study. You take a group, you take 100 people, get them stoned and put them on the highway, and get another 100 people and give them placebo marijuana and put them on the highway. That would be your most conclusive evidence. But we're never going to do that study. And we have to rely on imperfect evidence, such as this, to make our decisions. No one's ever going to do that. And so we have to rely on these data. Then we have to rely on the kind of laboratory studies like the one I mentioned to you, where we can control things and looked at simulated driving. And when we put all that together, we may have a better picture of this issue of driving and marijuana.
I think that my explanation for why I'm asking this question would indicate to you that I don't think there is a perfect data set. But I think that what we have in this study, the fact that we're looking at 1 2-year period versus only one other 2-year period says that this imperfect set of data is not even close to enough to make a conclusion, but we could disagree on that. Let me ask you a question about the statement that comes out of this study about teens in that area being the number one users. So this gets to how data works as well. If you look at only 2011, 2012 versus what's happened after legalization, you would go from number 4 to number 1. But if you go backwards, you would recognize it went from number 14 to number 4 prior to legalization, and that there was a trend towards number 1 already. So how do we get the fact that they were trending towards number 1, and then you have legalization and they actually hit number 1 when they were on the way to number 1 to tell us that legalization got us to number 1?
So that's a That's an excellent question. I don't have a great answer for you other than I think it may be a little myopic for us just to look at Colorado. There's a really nice graph. I wish I could show it to you. Looking at the states that have legalized the state for recreational use, the states that have legalized for medical use, and you can see very convincingly that the states that have legalized for recreational use have the highest rates of marijuana use by adolescents, not just Colorado. All the states that have legalized for recreational use. Now, you can attribute causality to anything, but I would imagine that looking at that trend, I'm fairly convinced that there's some relationship that needs to be looked at. That is, legalization is associated with increased teen use of marijuana.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Could it be possible, though, that legalization happened in places where they were already high, like Colorado?
It's conceivable. I haven't actually seen those data, so I can't really confirm that. But if you look at the overall data, all the 50 states, it's pretty clear. States that have legalized it, states that have legalized it for recreational or medical, have much higher rates of cannabis use amongst their youth than states that haven't.
Right, and because you're an expert, your testimony means a lot. So I'm just trying to make sure that if you're testifying to something, that, and with no disrespect, that it actually means what we may interpret it to mean. So that's why I'm asking that question. Did you speak about in your testimony about addiction and marijuana? Can you briefly go over that again?
Sure. So there's really no question that marijuana is addictive. I think in the field of mental health, we have certain criteria that we use to define an addiction, and that includes the compulsive use of a substance, spending time, spending money, acquiring the drug, being high on it, recovering from the drug, or trying to quit the drug. Tolerance, which means that the more the longer you use, the more you need to reach the desired effect. Using it in dangerous situations such as driving, etc. So these are the common criteria we use to define addiction. And to that extent, cannabis is addictive. It used to be thought at one time that animals would not self-administer cannabinoids, and now there's data showing that monkeys will self-administer cannabinoids. All these data put together would suggest that cannabis is addictive. And as a physician, as a psychiatrist working at a hospital, people are actually showing up asking for treatment for cannabis addiction because they can't quit on their own. And unfortunately, we do not have any good treatments for cannabis addiction.
And so you're not suggesting that it's more addictive than any of the other drugs or even caffeine or anything.